Hello everyone. I was asked a little while ago to tackle the subject of elemental beings versus fairies, or contrasted with fairies, are they fairies? And I have put off doing this video for a little bit because I've been trying to research it, and I have actually found it sort of difficult to get any quality in-depth information on what elementals are, who elementals are, just really anything relating to those types of beings. It's kind of proven more complicated to research than I expected. The majority of what I've been able to find is fairly modern information, so I had put off doing this because I was trying to dig more into it. I've kind of come to the conclusion at this point that what I've been able to find is what there is to find. So I'm just going to go ahead and make this video with the information that I have available. If anyone out there watching this can offer any additional information or point at any resources, I would appreciate it. Post some links in the comments. We can make part 2, dig more into it. I love researching things, so that would be super awesome. But this is sort of where I'm at with the subject at this point. This is what I've been able to find out. This is where all of my research has led. This is where we are. So, when we talk about what fairies are, as anyone who has watched my previous videos on my YouTube channel knows, my personal approach tends to be to focus primarily on the beings that we find in the Celtic language-speaking cultures, sort of secondarily on beings that are found in related Western European cultures, which are also often sort of lumped under that umbrella term of fairies, and then occasionally include beings that I refer to as fairy-like beings that can be found sort of throughout the world. What qualifies something as a fairy, in my opinion, and based on my understanding of sort of the academic definition of what a fairy is it is something that is otherworldly in nature, as in its nature. It is a being who comes from the other world into this world, is connected to this world, interacts with this world, might even partially live in this world, but its nature and its origins and its home are elsewhere, are from the other world, in another world. And I've done whole separate videos on what fairies are, the meaning of the word fairies. I don't want to get too sidetracked into all of that here. But suffice to say, when we're talking about fairies, that kind of is where we're at with what fairies are. They are independent, sentient beings. They have a lot of personality and character when we look at the folklore and the anecdotal material. They can be very devious, they can be malicious, they can be ambivalent, they can be benevolent. Kind of this whole range of personality and interaction with human beings. Sort of some of the key factors that define what a fairy is, as opposed to some other types of beings out there, say classical angels, demons, some of the other super culturally specific types of beings that would not be considered fairies per se, is that things like they are independent beings, whereas angels, as I understand them, are beings that are created and exist in service to a divine being. Fairies are not. They're not in service to anything, they don't exist in connection to that. Putting aside the entire cosmological argument about the potential origin of fairies from a Christian standpoint for the moment in this video, generally speaking, fairies have a lot of their own independent agency. They're going to do what they want to do. They're not sort of guided by the will of a higher power, if you will, the way some other types of beings could be, again, according to mythology or folklore or what have you. Fairies are also beings that, again, according to all these sources, may be tangible or may be intangible, may be visible or may be invisible, can directly influence human beings if they choose to. Sort of all of these qualifications get into what fairies are or are not. When we look at the relationships between humans and fairies, that gets super complicated, but it's fairly clear from, again, the bulk of this aggregated material that while there is definitely a symbiotic connection between these beings of the other world and humans, they do not need us to exist. And they are not reliant upon us, although, again, there is some symbiosis going on. They do look to us for certain specific things, so it gets very complicated in that area. But they exist separate from us. Interconnected, but also independent. The other thing to keep in mind when we're talking about fairies, and I promise this is all relevant to this wider discussion, is that fairies tend to have a very changeable nature. This is something that Reverend Robert Kirk mentioned in his 17th century work, Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies. He refers to their nature as changeable, likens it to an astral sort of substance. But what I'm sort of going for here more specifically is that they're not limited in any sense to a particular domain, if you will. They are often understood in modern terms as being very liminal beings. They are beings that exist between things, between realities, between times, between substances, and also between the elements as we would understand them. So we see a lot of types of fairies who are connected to earth and air, or water and air, or water and earth, or what have you. They are, of course, known to be shapeshifters, but they're also known to sort of transition between these different realms. Not just between the other world, which is sort of their native place, if you will, and the human world, which is our native place, again, if you will. But they might be connected to the ocean or the sea in our world, but also traveling on land. They might be connected to caves, to dwelling underground in our world, but also to traveling above the earth. They might be connected to traveling in the air, but also on the ground. So they have this sort of transient nature, this sort of connection to different elements. This is important. I am going somewhere with this. Now, when we look at elemental beings, and again, my research on this has proven more difficult than I anticipated, but when we look at elemental beings, the general understanding that I have come across, the books that I have read that discuss them, the online sources that I have found that discuss them, generally view elementals as the personification, embodiment, or inspiriting of a particular element. And when we're talking about the elements in this case, as opposed to my previous examples where I was discussing fairies and elements, relating them to like sea, earth, and sky, which is a bit more of an Irish view, in this case, talking about elemental beings, we would be talking about the classical Greek and Roman elements, which would be earth, air, water, and fire. Sometimes people toss in a fifth, which would be spirit, but primarily when we're talking about elemental beings, what you will see being brought up and discussed are these four elements of air, fire, water, and earth. These also have directional correspondence and all sorts of other things, colors and emotions, all that fun stuff. But each one originally comes from these Greek concepts which related to them to the idea that everything in manifest reality was sort of made of these building blocks, which were these four elements. And that human beings were very strongly influenced by these four elements. Now, again, from my understanding of this, what happened later on, particularly getting into like the 15th and 16th century, when alchemy became everyone's favorite hobby, we run across this particular person named Paracelsus, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, who came up with some very specific types of correspondences to work with, which involved these four elements. Alchemy being the study of the transmutation of substances into other substances, sort of a pseudoscience or early scientific process. And Paracelsus in particular took this idea of the four elements and assigned them these correspondences, which included the idea that each element had a realm, each realm had a ruler, and each realm was associated with a type of being. Unfortunately, the types of beings that he chose, which were sort of randomly picked from a variety of different European cultures, were already considered to be or associated with what we would today call fairies. So this is where things start to get complicated. So we have, if I'm remembering this correctly, air was associated by alchemists and Paracelsus with sylphs, which are a type of air being, air fairy. Water was connected to Undinas. Undina are a more Eastern European type of water being, water fairy. Fire was associated with salamanders. I don't actually know a ton about salamanders, I'll be honest with you, but they're a type of being that live and exist within fire. And then earth he connected to gnomes. Now you can kind of already see that this is a little problematic in the way he's putting it together, because he's picking bits and pieces from a variety of different unrelated cultures and sort of throwing them into this correspondence system, which is not generally the best way to do things, in my opinion. But this was how he came up with this idea of specific elemental beings being associated with these particular elemental building blocks of the universe. The way he describes them, again, as I understand it, is that these elemental beings are embodiments of and bound to the elements that they represent. So a salamander as a fire elemental cannot exist outside of fire. Fire is its nature, fire is part of what it is. The same thing with sylphs, the same thing with Undinas from his perspective. Now, in particular, when we look at some of these beings that exist within separate folklore, it gets even more problematic because these are beings that have their own folklore and that would not be considered elemental beings in the culture they come from. They would just be seen as a type of fairy being. They have their own stories and own connections, and they're not limited to this particular element. In the same way we had earlier discussed fairies as existing in these sort of liminal states and transient between elements, not even the classical elements, but between places in our world. So we get this idea then coming in through alchemy. It's further developed and taken into ceremonial magic, again, as far as I understand it from what I've been able to find in my research. And then we hit the 18th and 19th centuries. And in particular, during this period, theosophy starts to be developed and come around. And theosophy blends a variety of different pre-existing concepts, sort of comes up with a few of its own. But one of the things that it does is really takes all fairies, all fairy lore, and divides them up and categorizes them using this elemental system, so that all fairies become either water fairies or earth fairies or fire fairies or air fairies. And they're all sort of divided and systemized using this process that is coming out of alchemy and ceremonial magic. And through this process, they are then sort of all lumped in and understood as elemental beings. Even though elemental beings, from this original view, are all seen as being embodiments of the element that they're connected to or represent. And as I've already mentioned, this is a problem because we already know that fairies, pick any particular type of fairy that you want to use an example here, are not limited to, bound to, or generally exemplify any particular element that we could discuss. As with everything, there's going to be some that could appear to be exceptions here, but I'm pretty confident with what I'm saying that when we look at fairy lore, when we look at anecdotes, they really don't fit the descriptions and the general understanding of what elementals are. The problem, however, is that as theosophy moved forward and sort of gets adopted and evolves into the New Age movement, and aspects of it get incorporated into modern paganism, the view and the idea that fairies and elementals are synonymous becomes very embedded and widespread, and generally not something that people put a lot of thought into. It's just sort of assumed or taken for granted. Never a good idea to either assume or take for granted that fairies and elementals are the same thing, and that fairies can be divided up by these four classical elements. One of the particular issues that I will point out, which I did mention really briefly a little earlier, is that the idea of the four classical elements, earth, air, fire, and water, is specifically sort of a Greek and Roman and that area of the world kind of thing. When we look at other cultures, for example, if we look at the Celtic cultures, they don't have the same idea of four elements as the building block of manifest reality. In fact, you can find various lists of different assortments of elements, 5, 7, 9, I think there's one that even goes up to 13. So right there is a problem. You can't work from the assumption that four elements are a universal concept when four elements are in fact not a universal concept. And we actually see various cultures with very different understandings of potentially what the elemental makeup of our world is. I also am always super, super hesitant. This is part of why I use the term fairy-like for beings in non-European cultures. I'm also super hesitant anytime you're taking a core concept from one culture and trying to shoehorn folklore and beliefs from a different culture into that concept. That's rarely a good idea, and it usually does not work out well. I see people do this all the time, for example, when they're approaching the Irish gods, and they're asking where is the sun god and the moon goddess. Doesn't work that way. It's a classical concept. There is a sun god because you have Apollo, and there's a moon goddess because you have Selene or Artemis. Not every single culture approaches their cosmology and their spirituality the same way. The Norse, for example, have a sun goddess and a moon god. The Irish, because Ireland is just super fabulous, we don't know if there was a moon deity. There probably was, and there's some hints that there were, but we don't know for certain, and we certainly don't know what the name of that moon deity would have been, and if it would have been a god or a goddess. I kind of lean towards thinking it probably would have been a god, but we don't know for certain. And there's quite a selection of deities that are connected to the sun in some way, as opposed to being, one specific one. So we see the same issue when we're talking about fairies in relation to the classical elements and to this much more modern idea of elemental beings, that you really can't take the idea of fairies, take the folklore and the anecdotal accounts of fairies, and try to force them to fit into the concept of elemental beings. If you do believe in the idea of four elements and that there are elementals, that there are embodiments of those elements that exist, that's fine. I'm not by any means saying that you should not have that belief. But fairies, as we find them in folklore, really do not lend themselves to joining with that concept. The elemental beings, again, as I understand them from my research, are not, they're not equivalent to fairies. They don't have the same independence, they don't have the same agency, they don't have the same active personality. They are literally embodiments of water or embodiments of fire. They only exist within the element that they embody, which puts some very specific limitations on them, on what they are, the parameters of their existence, if you will, which we do not find with the good neighbors, with the fairies. So these are all just things to consider. When we're looking at the question of, are fairies elementals, I think we can fairly unequivocally say no, they are not. Fairies are a separate sort of thing. If we're asking the question, are elementals fairies, I would personally also tend to say no, they are not. They are a separate sort of thing. Based on the criteria we laid out at the very beginning of this video, what is a fairy? Elemental beings do not fit that definition. Elemental beings do not come from the other world. They literally come from material elements, fire, air, water, earth, what have you, not from an alternate world by any description or name. They are not independent, they don't have agency, they're really not symbiotically connected to humanity in any way, at all. A fire elemental is going to exist connected to fire whether or not humanity exists in any sense whatsoever, and the same with water and earth and air. So I think if we're just looking at, are elementals fairies, the answer to that would also be no. They are just completely separate concepts. How they got blended together, basically some dude in the 16th century was working on a system to do with alchemy and decided, as part of this massive correspondence thing he was coming up with, that he would include very particular named sorts of fairy beings connected to specific elements. That went on for a couple hundred years, and then that got taken and just massively expanded. And then in our modern terms has become this sort of idea that all fairy beings must fit into some kind of elemental understanding. But it's sort of like saying, what sort of elemental would a human being be? Is a human an earth element? Are we an air element because we breathe air? we need water to live, or we are a water element. It doesn't make any sense. Like, I personally cannot process that concept because we would need all of them to survive and exist and be healthy. And it's sort of the same thing with the fair folk. You can't break them down into these specific elemental concepts because they are also liminal and they also involve more than just one of any particular one of these. So it's too complicated to simplify in that way. I do realize, of course, that if you pick up at least half of the pagan books on any given bookshelf, in any given store, any given online shopping cart, they are quite possibly going to reference fairies as elementals, or just assume that fairies are elementals and talk about them in that context. But I hope that this video has at least given everyone some serious food for thought and reason to really question the accuracy of that. My opinion decidedly falls in the no category on both ends. If you want some more information about the fair folk, because, like I said, I really couldn't find that much on elementals that was, valid or had any substance to it. I highly recommend Laura O'Brien's YouTube channel. She does a Folklore Friday thing where she shares little folklore stories from Irish culture, I should specify. There's also a Facebook page called Circle Stories, which digs into the fairy lore. Duicious.ie, great site, lots of good fairy lore on there. There's more resources. I could keep going, and of course I'm naming all Irish things because that's what immediately comes into my head. But my point here is dig into the real solid fairy lore, the folklore, the anecdotes, and I would think it would become clear very quickly why fairies and elementals are not the same thing and are very separate types of beings. If you do choose to continue to believe that they are connected or related, that is entirely up to you. I'm not telling you what to believe or what not to believe, but I do encourage you to give some serious thought to all this, and to just be aware that this is the history of it, as far as I've been able to find, for how we've gotten the concept of elementals sort of in our modern culture, and then the much older, sort of heavier concept of fairies that we have going on. So that's where we're at with this. If anyone has any additional information about elementals, elemental spirits, the history of it, please feel free to tell me. I will say, though, don't bother to give me information on the classical elements in ancient Greece. That's not very helpful in this case. I'm already very aware of it. I know how that all got started. I'm more interested in specifically the idea of elemental beings, and spirited embodiments of the four classical elements, not the 2,000, 3,000 year old history of the concept of four elements in ancient Greece. That's less helpful. But if you have more information before Paracelsus about the idea of elemental beings or how they could have gotten confused with fairies, that would be super useful. We can definitely have a discussion about that. Otherwise, I hope everyone at least found this either entertaining or educational. That's our video for today, Fairies and Elementals, and I will try to make another video soon. I know I keep saying that, and then it's lots of time between videos, but unfortunately life keeps getting in the way. We'll talk to you all later. Have a wonderful day.